This is the Back Porch Education Podcast. Today, the long-awaited defense of poetry in the classroom.
Get your education. Back Porch Education.
Welcome back to the podcast, folks. And once again today, I'm here with Jason. And last episode, we read to you a 20-minute poem. And I emphasize each aspect of that with the expectation that having taken 20 minutes of our listeners' time in the last episode, we're probably going to skip any kind of a poem today, right, Jason?
Well, I could see why you would think that, but what if we just did a four-liner today?
Okay, I'll compromise, but
Okay.
leave it to you to feel like 20 minutes wasn't enough. We got
Right.
All right.
Yeah, so, what's his name? Frost talks about having young kids come to me with half a quatrain. And that makes me think of a quatrain. And so, I don't know. I didn't plan this out beforehand, so you would think that on an episode of discussing poetry, I would have come up with an awesome poem. I didn't, and so we're left with what I can remember. So let's do this one by Walter Savage Landor. It's entitled Dying Speech of an Old Philosopher. It hits quick. It's only 4 lines. I strove with none, for none was worth my strife. Nature I loved, and next to nature, art. I warmed both hands before the fire of life. It sinks, and I am ready to depart. Well, let me tell you what I think, Steve, rather than putting you on blast again.
Well, no, that's off the top of your head.
Yeah. That's one worth remembering.
Yeah. I am impressed, if nothing else.
Yeah, Savage or Walter Savage Landor wrote this quatrain. I was turned on to it, I think, reading through like one of the letters of Frost or something. I don't know. I don't remember where I came across it, but at some point, I'm pretty sure Frost said that for a while, this quatrain was the best quatrain ever written. And so I thought, well, hey, I got to know it, and so, yeah, this one's awesome. Landor wrote it as an old man, obviously. Well, perhaps not obviously, but I think it's fitting that he was old. And that sort of metaphor of the fire of life and him warming his hands beside it.
Yeah.
And then sort of being ready. It sinks. The fire of life is sinking. And I am ready. I'm ready to depart. That's noble.
Yeah, and I love the sort of twin curricula that he puts forth there, nature and next to nature art.
Yeah, good.
That's a pretty nifty way to summarize it, right? Life is what's real around me, but it's also what's in me. The reflections of reality within me, which I think I'm impressed it's off the top of your head, and I'm impressed that you, I think, hit a great one for this topic, for the discussion we have after last time, spending 20 minutes on a poem, and then somewhat admittedly sort of hemming and hawing around afterwards about how we don't have enough time to really say anything about it, because we try to stick to 30-minute episodes, and we used up most of our time on Frost's Build Soil poem. So Jason and I want to come back today and sort of unpack a little bit why we would have given an episode like that and where we see poetry play out. Both Jason and I obviously are humanities folks, and we teach a lot of literature and philosophy and words. So we naturally love poetry, but I don't think we're going to let ourselves off the hook by saying, well, we just love poetry, so we get a kick out of doing it. We think that there's more of a reason to it than that. So I'm going to let Jason kind of take the ball and run with. He's the guy that thrust build soil upon us, so,
Right.
so he gets the fun of getting us started with why. Why would we do
it's
that?
It's my defense, right?
That's right. I'm
Yeah.
just here to hand you the hemlock.
Oh yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I'll drink up presently. So let me say this. I think that there are a lot of reasons beyond we just get a kick out of it. I also will die on the hill that says getting a kick out of it is reason enough. So we're going to move beyond that in this episode, but I think that that my apology could end there and that it would sort of stand, right? But that being said, go ahead.
I'm not going to let that be said.
Okay.
I want you to explain why you're willing to tell a listener who's listening to a podcast on education why getting a kick out of it's enough. Shouldn't we be doing things that are utilitarian, gonna have results,
Yes.
Do you think getting a kick out of poetry cultivates wisdom or virtue?
I do. So that's the thing. It does get a result. Like the kick is a result, and I think we're mixing, metaphors, or at least I am pretty bad here. But I think the kick does things. I think that it, when we say this isn't, if I can sort of appeal to etymology here, this isn't amusement, like sort of amuse without amuse. I think that there is lots in this poem that is good and true and beautiful, wonderful, and worth contemplation. And so the kick that we get is an instructive one, is a guiding one, even, right? And so, okay, let's take a different poem that we've said before. What was that one about the purple cow? Like, I don't. That's funny. That was like, okay, that was something that we did, but I don't put that on the same level as build soil. And so if you're content to sort of hang out with the purple cow level of poetry,
which is probably better labeled as amusement.
Yeah, exactly.
The benefit of that kind of amusing poem is just the wordplay itself.
Right, which is not nothing, but it's not as much as it could be.
I'm tossing the word ball around, getting better at catching it and throwing it, but it's not the real game.
Right.
And at build soil is getting in, it's much like your quatrain here, saying something significant.
Yes.
There is truth that will lead me towards goodness. And I think in particular with poetry, it's the beauty, the kick that you're talking about is what I think is correctly called sublimity.
That's very Coleridgean of you, I think.
Well, and I think that's probably where I'm pulling it from.
Yeah, that's good.
But this notion that beauty moves me.
Yeah.
And if it's beauty, it's true and good. And so certainly you can try and communicate truth in a very bland, mild manner.
Sure.
Hands in the pockets, shrugging shoulders, guys, this is just true and take it or leave it. But who wants to teach that way?
That's right. That's right. And who wants to learn that way? Like, is that even?
Well, yeah, exactly.
Like, is that even the best sort of? I don't know.
In the end, it's probably not effective. Yeah. And you and I both know the reason we throw poetry around so much is that 9 times out of 10, when I get into the poetic side of the class, whether it's an actual poem or some other way in which truth or goodness is portrayed beautifully, that's when the kids forget we're in class and get into it.
That's right. Okay.
When it moves them, when it arouses their passions,
right.
as dangerous as that is to do with teenagers,
sure.
When you get them going, it starts. It's real to them. They care, and it's no longer dangling the you need to know this to get a good job, or you need to get that A or whatnot. This is compelling.
Yes,
and I think it's that true compulsion rather than the compulsion that we've talked about elsewhere of, well, you have to go to school because you're not yet 16.
Right.
I want to be in this conversation because it's interesting.
Something's happening. Yeah, exactly. So I just thought of a metaphor, and I want to put it out there and see what happens. Sort of the intricacy and the difficulty, the ornaments of poetry are, I'm going to say, a sort of web of ropes. Okay. And they're above the head of student. So that web of ropes is difficult to sort of work with and work through and understand and try to find his or her way through. But once the student has worked through that web of ropes, then it acts as a sort of support. Like once you've climbed through it and you're on the other side, that ornament holds you up so that you're able to stand higher. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's picturesque as a metaphor should be, and I like it because it's claiming activity.
Right.
So when I teach reading to students, many of them want to be passive. They want to just drag their eyeballs across the page and say they've read it. And I'm like, but what were you thinking while you were reading it? Well, I was thinking about the words. What were you thinking about the words? Well, I was thinking what comes next. Okay. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but an active reader is bombarding the text with questions.
Yep. Yeah, pressing on the edges.
That? Prove that.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's trying to figure it out and asking the author to defend his position and asking the author, what do you mean by that? Why'd you say it that way? And I think poetry, because it's not linear in the same way that prose would be, pushes. I mean, prose makes you think. You're asking questions as he starts with A and he heads eventually to Z, and we're somewhere in C or D or E. We're anticipating where he's going with this. We're trying, has he proved his case so far? And so, but we're following him rather easy. Now a poem comes along and starts using language in ways that I'm not used to it being used.
Right. Starts
drawing in metaphor. Starts expanding the possibilities. And especially for young people, it's refreshing and scary. It's a roller coaster.
Absolutely.
I want to get on it. I want to ride it. I want the jack from the exhilaration. But the exhilaration comes from being scared out of my mind. Right.
A very uncertain, vulnerable. Yeah. Like
is this the time when it all falls apart?
Right.
or 3 minutes later, am I going to be safely back where I began?
Right.
And so that's where my metaphor of the roller coaster breaks down, because it isn't a loop.
Right.
It takes you where you've never been before, and you can't get back from there.
Yeah.
Once you have that quatrain of the old philosopher, I mean, you can forget it, but you can't undo it in your life.
Yeah, exactly. It shaped the soul in a certain way.
Yeah,
and the soul will forever bear the sort of dent or whatever that was impressed upon it. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that shoot, I forgot what I was going to say. Well, whatever.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to press Jason on the question of poetry outside the literature, the word classroom. It obviously has a place in English class. It obviously has a place in philosophy, maybe in music class because we got to have lyrics to sing. But when we get back, I want Jason to tell us what poetry has to do with math or science, apart from being an artifact. What's it have to do with history, etc.?
Get your education. Backward education.
All right, Steve. So the gauntlet's been thrown down. What does poetry have to do with other classrooms? And when we say that, we're sort of the sciences or what have you. I think that I would run into trouble if I started to go class by class and try to make like a one for one connection, right? Like if I wanted to do something like, if I said, okay, well, poetry teaches us about math because of there has to be a balance to things and, substitution or whatever. Like, I think I would probably, I might be able to do that okay for a little bit, but I think I would run into trouble, right? Because I don't know that it always functions that way. But
Well,
I do think.
I'm
Oh,
glad you
sorry.
fell into my trap.
Okay. All right,
I'm,
good. So first landmine averted.
I'm glad to hear you say that because that's really how I approach it. I don't think poetry is a subject in school. Okay, it's a
Right.
mode of learning. And any mode of learning should be, to greater or lesser degree, useful in studying any kind of truth.
Mm-hmm.
And so the metaphorical or the analogical, which is really what poetry is,
Exactly.
the coming at it outside the box is incredibly important to
Mm-hmm.
math or science or
Yep.
any other. We've done this to ourselves. We've chopped up truth into these little portions and then get
Mm-hmm.
mad if they overlap, but they do overlap.
Right. That's what
So
education is, right? Like sort of seeing those overlaps.
getting rid of the divisions, not
Yeah.
defending them.
Right.
And so to me, the the math, science, history, foreign language isn't even really a question, right? Because every language has its poetry. And I
Exactly.
think one of the most challenging and exciting ways to work at understanding and translating a foreign language. I had a fellow in college one time and I asked him, what's your minor? And he said, French. And I said, what's wrong with you?
Right. Sure.
And he said, man, have you ever read French poetry? And I said, well, no, I don't know French.
Right.
And he said, exactly. And
Mm.
I know what you're missing, but you don't.
Yeah.
And he left it at that.
Sure.
He didn't tell me a thing. And so then I had to go run off and kind of sidle up to some girl at school who was a French major
Mm-hmm.
and see if she could kind of hear there's something in this French poetry. She's like, are you trying to hit on me?
Right.
And I said, what are you talking about? And she says, well, the French are known for their romantic poetry. And then I was mad at the guy, of course.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
But he was right.
Sure. He is. Yeah.
That entrance into another language's poetry is entrance into their deepest thoughts. And there's no part of life that's off limits from poetry. So, of course, there are poems that include a play with number or with, my students, one of their favorites is, who wrote it? Wordsworth with The Flea. Are you familiar with this poem where he's contemplating the fact that this flea may have bit his lover and thereby have a bit of her blood in him, and he's impious.
That's right.
Because he'd like to be close enough to bite his lover. and my students eat that up. But is that a text for studying science? No, but it's a great thing to bring up in invertebrate zoology, right? When you're in the study of insects and you can rattle off this little poem about a flea,
Right.
your students are going to be much more into that than just, now let's talk about the flea.
Right.
So I
And
think,
not that it's sort of like we're not saying that if you read a poem about a flea or recite, it would be even better. Something, a poem about a flea, all of your students are going to sort of sit up straight and instantly become totally
uh,
enamored with what's going on. Like, that's not how poetry works.
right.
Um, it's as easy to ignore as it is to love.
Well, what I find most students, it's easier to whine about it than anything
Uh,
else. Oh no,
right,
not another poem. Elliot,
right.
shut up. Stop that.
And that may be sort of what's most compelling about poetry to students. I said it's easier to ignore. I don't know though. Like, I didn't have many students ignore the poetry that I read every single day in class. I had a few that loved it and ate it up. I had a few, or I had many who were like frustrated, right? And say, why did they write it that way? But that's the thing, right? Like you were talking about earlier with prose, it's so ABC, like linear,
Yeah,
that we can trick ourselves into believing that the writer did not think carefully about what he wrote. But with poetry, it's so obvious that so many decisions were made that it cannot easily be ignored.
yeah,
Like that a student looks at it and goes, not why would you talk about fleas? That's what they would ask about the textbook that includes fleas. Like, why would you talk about this? I don't care about fleas. But a poem, written in verse, they would say, are you kidding me? Why on earth would this be important enough for you to make all these decisions about it?
yeah.
And it
And
really brings that up, right?
it's like one of those little puzzles, right? Those physical puzzles where you've got to get all the rings apart or whatnot. That
Hmm.
it's there in front of them. Many poems are small enough to feel like it's manipulable. And so,
Hmm.
just like
Hmm.
in math class, you might throw a bunch of blocks down in front of a kid and start having him manipulate them to figure out a math problem. With words, we've thrown a pile of words at them that are
Yeah.
maybe not arranged the way we would that linearity isn't there, and so the mind just naturally, the curious mind, and and
Yes.
and Aristotle believed strongly everybody really does want to learn, really does want to
Hmm.
figure out a puzzle. You've just put a puzzle in front of them, and I think that it when I think through why have poetry in my classroom. I'm talking in a little bit about the negatives that everybody quickly wants to bring up, and I think there's ways to answer those. But first of all, the positives. I don't know of anything that is better at begging the mind to figure itself out.
Yes. That's my first thing.
Especially if I teach students that we might all see something different in this
Hmm.
poem, it frees them up to think for themselves as opposed to what does Mr. Elliott think the right answer is here.
Hmm.
And of course, my students are always worried about having the right answer. I'm just not teaching them
Right.
correctly. That
Right.
doesn't sound good, I suppose, to say on an education podcast. But what I mean by that is that especially in the deeper truths, we as humans disagree about what the right answer is.
Right.
And so working at it and talking about it is a lot of the answer to it. And so I think that it's calling the mind deeper into truth. It's making them better with words,
Hmm.
especially if we're evaluating together. Why did he say it that way?
Exactly.
It's amazing to me how often I'll see hints and bits and pieces of the poetry we've studied in the past, sometimes even years in the past,
Mm.
show up in my students' own writing.
Yeah. And
right?
that's amazing, right? Like that's because isn't that what we're trying to do? Like it not only does poetry, like you mentioned, sort of beg the mind to engage and to fiddle, right? To sort of manipulate this thing and try and figure it out. But it also not only calls the student to, but also models for the student
Yeah,
excellent use of language. And
yeah,
so, like, if we see our students doing that, we say, man, fantastic. This is what we're here for. Like, isn't that why you come to school?
yeah. It builds very much like, and this is why it's so important that it be quality poetry.
Yeah.
It's building a word palette. Just
Yeah.
as I might take my children to a nice restaurant and have them taste really refined and excellently prepared food, and then the next time they're at Burger King, they're kind of like, this isn't quite the same. So, so with words, we build this word craft. This
Mhm.
we're making them chefs with words, and they want the best words to cook with, so to speak. I guess it's a
Right.
terrible analogy,
Right. Right. No,
but
no, I
that's what they're
think it's
doing.
good.
They're
You can work with that. Like, because this sort of, well, now we're back to taste, right? And this
yeah,
sort of grading of taste and this leveling and appreciating sort of things that are more difficult to appreciate. For instance, let me tell this story. Right, I read to my seventh graders poetry every day, every single day. They loved it, they hated it, whatever. We worked through it, and they got better at appreciating it. Well, one day in the third quarter, I read to them a very very famous poem about a red wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams, and it is sort of, well, let me say it this way. I read to them this poem by William Carlos Williams. It's entitled The Red Wheelbarrow, and they weren't ready. Now, to be frank, I'm not sure I was ready either, because if you read this poem, if you look it up, there's not much to it. And I get that Williams was doing something very significant. And this is one of the most celebrated poems of the 20th century. Okay. But to be completely honest, and this may just show my ignorance of poetry, but my students, my seventh graders, and I, we had a wonderful 10 minutes laughing our heads off at this poem. And we sort of were, laughing over and over saying, this is a poem? That's it, they would say, right? Like, that's the whole thing. They all started cracking up.
yeah,
And that to me was significant that we had reached the point where we were sort of on the same page about poetry, like that they were responding in a similar way, right? Like that we were all learning the same thing. That was really big. Maybe read poetry a couple more years and they can start to say, oh, I see. Williams is reacting to some of the other poets of the time or whatever. Well, that's later on. But for then, it was enough that they saw the difference between what we had previously read and Williams' famous poem.
yeah.
So it's not always pretty. It's sometimes quite a slow process, but I do think that when it comes to our students learning use of language, facility with words, common metaphors, uncommon metaphors, that poetry is sort of preeminent in its ability to model and to teach those things. So I really like it for that. But I still even want to go back to something that old, what's his name? Joseph Pieper said, right? When he said, it may be true that a man who says his prayers before he goes to bed sleeps better, but if you say your prayers so that you will sleep better, you've totally missed the point. I do also think that poetry sort of functions that way, that there are some benefits to poetry, right? Like facility with words. But if that's the only reason that you're reading it, then
Yeah.
you've missed the
Yeah.
point. That it's actually something that you touched on much earlier, the sort of soul shaping nature of it.
Well, before we end this episode, I do want to address some of the common reactions to poetry,
Yeah,
one of which comes up on a regular basis on this podcast. You guys spend the first few minutes. Poetry eats up time,
it does.
and time is we've got to do an episode or 15 on the teacher and time,
Yeah.
because I spend a good chunk of my time consulting with teachers. When I'm being asked questions, most of them are coming out of this extreme notion of busyness, time management, get her done.
Mm-hmm.
There's just so much that we've got to cram in.
Efficiency.
It can get through the program kind of thinking, and certainly poetry eats time.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't even use it effectively unless you're willing to give it its time.
Right.
In the given lesson, I think there ought to be some sort of preparation. Then there's the poem itself. There may even be the need to revisit a portion of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's so what?
Yep.
Which demands reflective time before the kids are even really. You do this to me every episode, right? So, Steve, what'd you think?
Right.
Well, give me 5 minutes and I'll give you some thoughts. But because it's so deep, it does require time.
Yeah.
And you referenced Pieper. This is the contemplative life.
Yeah.
Having enough time, having enough guts to set aside the work to just take a few minutes or hours and deal with something as unutilitarian as poetry is. Because in the end, it's not going to make you another dollar in life. It's not going to make you healthier. It's not going to. You can't sell poetry out on the marketplace like it's medicine.
Nope.
It is for the soul, but not for the pocket.
But people aren't paying for soul medicine.
Yeah. Right. Well, starving poets and all that.
Right.
But anything you want to defend, Jason?
Yeah. So I think that you're right that it's often the case that people want to say that it's a waste of time. Like you said, it definitely is a use of time. I don't think that it's a waste. I think that you could waste it reading poetry, but I don't know. For me, I would take, anywhere between 3 to 8 minutes typically with my students, and just sort of, oh, hey, notice this, what's going on here? Oh, hey, notice this, what's going on here? And we would move on to our Latin lesson or whatever. But it was always, we were always making connections to the material, whatever it was. And I wasn't always aware of them going into it. Right. So I can't tell you how many times a student, we would read a poem and a student would go, hey, is that like the Latin word, whatever? And they would look into the etymology or be asking me about the etymology. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they were totally wrong. But in either case, we learned something about the root of a word or whatever. And so we were always engaging with the text, and that helped. I don't know. I think that probably the biggest I don't know, punch against poetry, or the way that people critique it most, was just this sort of notion of like, well, they're not going to get it. Like the kids don't hear this kind of stuff. They don't know this kind of stuff. And so they're not going to get it. And I would say that, okay, that may be the case, but that's what we do at school. Like anything that we can presume the students will learn without us, we don't teach that. We teach algebra because we assume that they're not going to pick it up somewhere else. If our culture was one that taught algebra to itself all the time, we wouldn't teach it in school. So that to me seems a reason to teach it, not to ignore it.
Exactly. And I think that all too often the adults, or in some cases the students themselves arguing against the study, don't realize that poetry is all around them all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not teaching them something that they wouldn't otherwise get. We're teaching them how to observe and see and hear and think about what's all around
Yes.
them. I don't know how many times I've had students become embarrassed when I pointed out to them that the poetry they were listening to with a beat
Mm-hmm.
was actually saying something.
Yeah.
And in many cases, somewhat against the moral code of our school.
Right. Or even
you really
worse,
want to be listening.
what
Go
they
ahead.
sort of profess, right? Like it's one
Right.
thing to disagree with what the school's moral standpoint is, but there are plenty of songs that people listen to that contradict even what they think, right?
Right,
And
right.
that's like, whoa, hey, all of a sudden that's buy-in, right? Like, wait a minute, I don't want to be inconsistent.
Right. And once they start seeing that other people have had the ability to observe to such a point, to think to such a point as to be able to express it memorably, beautifully,
Mm-hmm.
movingly,
Mm-hmm.
many of them, not all of them, but many of them are emboldened to start trying it themselves.
Mm.
One of the best experiences of teaching poetry is to have a kid at some point bold enough to say, hey, Mr. L, you mind? I wrote this poem.
Yep.
Well, let's see it. Let's hear it. Let's hey. And of course, that's another thing. I think a lot of teachers are very scared of poetry in the classroom because it is a dangerous thing. It is a hard thing, and it requires safety in the classroom.
Mm.
There is the quote unquote, what did you think, is a much more dangerous question with poetry than with a math problem.
Yeah, you can
even
really go a lot of places with it, right?
And they're scared that they might not say what receives approbation in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
When in fact, the whole point of poetry is getting them to go somewhere they may never have gone before. And that's just ripe with danger. They need to know that it's safe to do it. Mm-hmm. And we have so much with the STEM push. You know, why can't our kids exercise imagination? Why can't they be at the front end of developing new technologies? Why aren't we discovering? Well, I don't know of anything that presses the imagination more than poetry. And I think the same mind that's been prepared to think outside the word box by poems is the same mind that's going to think outside the box in other ways as well.
Yeah.
And I would admonish those who maybe, well, you language people, you get all excited about this. Science people ought to get excited. Mathematic people ought to get excited.
That's right.
I mean, math, if nothing else, you got to count the beat. Okay.
Right.
I mean, there's a rhythmical, harmonizing.
Sure.
There's got to be math and poetry, or it's not poetry.
Yeah.
So you're not outside the math box when you're in poetry, but I don't think you're out the science box either. If nothing else, one of the most beloved characteristics of a good scientist is somebody who approaches things differently than anyone else. Mm. Boom. That's the poet.
Yep. If there was something that cultivated the imagination and tested the imagination better than poetry, I would devote a portion of my class time to that too. But I don't know anything. So I'm sticking with what the human race has used since civilization began.
Fun talking with you about this. At some point, we got to talk about build soil.
Yep. Okay. It's coming.